Hello, I'm Jonathan Dunsky, author of the Adam Lapid Mysteries. Today I'd like to tell you about my development as a reader. And I'll be 45 at the end of this week, and I've been reading continuously since I was 6. And when I sort of reflected on my reading history, I realized that a lot of things have changed in the way that I read, in what I read, in my reading habits in general. And perhaps some of these changes are common among people my age, and perhaps you'll be able to relate to some of them as well. Um, but I thought I'll just share my own experience as a reader. So I live in Israel and I grew up here, and my native language is Hebrew. So one of the initial changes, or one of the things that's changed since my childhood, is that when I was a child, I read in Hebrew, and today I read mostly in English, and I also write in English. I write my own books in English. So when I began, I would read in Hebrew, and I don't remember exactly the sort of things that I read as a small child, as a beginner, but I do remember reading books by Enid Blyton. These were translated into Hebrew, and I remember reading her books several times, but I don't remember other writers or other books as clearly. When I grew up, when I became a teenager, my tastes developed and changed, and I became much more interested in fantasy and horror. And some of this is related to my involvement in a Dungeons and Dragons group in which I played along with friends from school. So I became much more interested in those genres, and I also started reading in English. So I would read a lot of Stephen King, Clive Barker, Dean Koontz, and fantasy writers like Robert Jordan. And I also became interested in science fiction. So I read a lot of Robert Silverberg and Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein and a lot of other writers in those genres. And that was the point in which I also learned English thoroughly. I would read those books with a dictionary at my elbow. Of course, in those days, it was a physical dictionary, and I would check each word that I was not familiar with, and in so doing, I just learned English properly and thoroughly, to the point that I'm now able to write mystery fiction in English. So I continued reading these genres, horror and science fiction and fantasy, into early adulthood. And by that time, I also started reading history books. I was always interested in history. These days, I write historical mysteries, which sort of, it shows that interest. So I just read nonfiction historical books, and I continued reading in those genres into as I said, into early adulthood, and somewhere probably in my late 20s, early 30s, my tastes shifted again, and I got into reading more thrillers and mystery fiction and things that were more, let's say, more realistic, set in the real world in which I was now an adult. And I also later on became a writer of mysteries. So I read a lot of, and my tastes remain firmly entrenched in those genres: thrillers, mysteries, and historical fiction as well. To this day, I'm a fan of Lawrence Block and Donald Westlake and Faye Kellerman and Michael Connelly and a lot of other crime novels. Too many to count, but you can find reviews of various crime novels and mystery fiction on this channel. Another thing that changed since my early years as a reader is how I read. Back then, when I was a child, of course, I would just read paper books, printed books, because that was the only format available, at least widely available in Israel. And later on, with the development of e-readers like the Kindle, I started reading a lot of ebooks, and it also proved more. I mean, it took less space in where I lived, and it allowed me to travel with my books more easily. And at a certain point, I also moved to the Netherlands, and I couldn't take all my books with me. And I used to travel a lot back and forth between Israel and the Netherlands. So the e-readers, the Kindle or the Kindle app on my phone or tablet proved very useful, and allowed me to widen the scope of my reading to become a much more eclectic reader. And I still read and I still read occasionally science fiction and fantasy, but I mostly focus on, as I said, crime fiction and thrillers and the occasional historical fiction, because that's the thing. These are the genres in which I write, and I write in them because these are the genres that I now enjoy reading as well. Later on in recent years, I've also become a big fan of audiobooks. At first, I did not believe that I would enjoy having a book read to me, but I've now become a huge fan of them, and I consume quite a few audiobooks, perhaps even more than I do as a reader, as the number of books that I actually read in printed format or in ebook. I believe it's because I now have less free time as a father and as someone who has to write my own books, and I need to, and I sort of find audiobooks a good fit for my lifestyle, because I can listen to them when I exercise, when I do various household chores, and this allows me to sort of involve myself in more stories than I would have been able to do otherwise, in more books. And becoming a fan of audiobooks is also one of the reasons why I produced my own audiobooks, even though they cost a great deal, because I knew as a fan of audiobooks, I wanted my books to be available in audio as well. So a lot of things changed. These days, I read in paper and in ebook format, and I listen to audiobooks as well. And sometimes I will listen to an audiobook and read it at the same time, and sort of sometimes the books are synced, sometimes they're not, but still I enjoy my books sometimes in both of these formats. And I think that I'm quite happy about the way that the reading experience has developed and widened for me and for so many other readers, because it allows us to experience more books that we would not have become familiar with without ebooks, without audiobooks, without them being widely available. And I've become a much more eclectic and my reader, and my reading range, the range of my reading, the range of the books that I consume has become much larger. And all this has enriched my life tremendously. And of course, the ebook and audiobook revolution also allowed me to write my own books and reach readers directly. So I don't think my story is in any way uncommon. But let me know in the comments how you developed as a reader since you first began reading books, how you read books today in comparison with how you read them years ago, and what format or what formats you enjoy reading or listening to the books that you choose to read these days. So let me know in the comments. I'd love to get your views and to learn of your experience. Thank you for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.